Welcome to the Toffee Blues, your source for all things Everton. I'm Connor Williams, joined here by Paul, otherwise known as the Esk on Twitter. Firstly, Paul, how have you been?
Good, thanks, Connor. Good to be back with you. And we've got quite a bit to talk about, haven't we?
I'm going to start off with asking you what you think about the Benitez appointment and some of the statements made from Moshiri, Kenwright and Brands.
Okay. Right. Where do we start?
Start
initially.
Start on your initial thoughts from
it. Initially quite sort of perturbed by the idea of Benitez coming in, not because necessarily he's a former Liverpool manager, although that obviously causes issues with some of the fan base, and I understand why it would cause issues with people that live in Liverpool, as against somebody like myself who doesn't, because clearly it makes us a target in a sense for Liverpool supporters. But more importantly than that, is he the right manager for our ambitions as a club? Is he a manager that frankly is past his best? Is he a manager that can bring the improvements, attract people into the club that we need in order to become successful? And I think there's big question marks over all of those questions. Now, clearly, he convinced Moshiri in the large number of meetings. I think they had 4 or 5 meetings as to the answers to those questions. But then you've got to ask yourself, well, why is it Moshiri that's asking those questions, not Marcel Brands, who's the guy who is supposed to be the football expert and effectively head of recruitment as the director of football. So the whole thing is sort of brought sharply into focus exactly where Everton are. First of all, that we couldn't attract a manager with a more relevant and better CV or more recent CV than Benitez. And secondly, that despite having a director of football and despite him just signing a new 3-year contract, we go back to exactly the same situation as happened with Koeman, happened with Silva, happened with Allardyce, and happened with Carlo, that we've got Farhad Moshiri choosing the manager, which on the basis of his track record, again throws up an awful lot of questions.
No problem. We'll get into what you've just mentioned there. So obviously Moshiri's picked the manager, and it's very much, he's come out and said that. I just want to get your thoughts on where this leaves Marcel Brands in terms of his director of football role, and especially now with the rumours that Benitez hasn't always worked well with a director of football in the past.
My understanding before Carlo left and when Brands signed his new 3-year contract was that Farhad Moshiri respected Marcel Brands, and he recognised his expertise, and obviously by virtue of offering him a new 3-year contract, saw that he had some value to the organisation going forward. Maybe Farhad Moshiri's view of what a director of football does is different from other people's, because clearly Farhad Moshiri doesn't believe that it includes choosing a manager, even though at the beginning of the process, the club sort of indicated that Marcel Brands was actually in control of the manager's selection. Now, he might have been in the early stages, but he certainly wasn't by the end of it. Marcel Brands has still got a huge amount of work to do at Everton. He's still got to sort out the academy, which, whilst improvements have started to take place, is still not, that piece of work is by no means complete. And I think somebody has to address the elephant in the room in terms of whether David Unsworth is still the right person to run the academy. That really is a decision, I think, for Marcel Brands and for Marcel Brands to make a recommendation to the board. Possibly he might do that in the not too distant future. I really don't know. But he's also got other issues as well, hasn't he? He's still got lots of people who've got contracts at Everton that don't necessarily fit into our first team. can he get rid of any more of those over this summer, or is it just going to be a question of loaning out players that aren't key to or core to the first team? And obviously the other question, and that question now is different from what it would have been with Carlo, is what does Marcel Brands do in terms of first team recruitment? Will Rafa Benitez have an entirely different view as to what he needs, given whatever his vision of Everton Football Club is going to be? So there's lots and lots of questions. Marcel Brands is going to be around. He's going to be around for the next 3 years, I think. I don't think he's going anywhere. But I think the club could help him, and Farhad Moshiri could help him enormously by making it very clear as to what his role is, what his responsibilities are, and actually what his strategy is moving forward. If they did that, it would clear an awful lot of the types of questions that we're all asking of him. Because clearly he's a talented person. He's got a tremendous track record. But the question will be, is he allowed to do the job that he's supposed to do whilst at Everton and under Farhad Moshiri as owner of the club?
No problem. So what did you make of the comments from Rafa Benitez himself? We'll go with Rafa Benitez first, and the interviews he did with the obviously with the club journalist and the club media.
I thought he did quite well. I thought he came across as obviously professional, experienced, focused. He came across as being confident in what he was saying, and there was a certain logic to what he said. Of course, he's always going to be the best person in terms of promoting himself. If you can't promote yourself, I think you have a major problem. So it's not unsurprising that he spoke well, and clearly he must have spoken well at the various interviews as done previously. The key is whether or not the type of person he is, the style of management, the style of football that he wants to play, whether or not that actually progresses Everton on the pitch. As I say, whether in terms of recruitment, it allows us to bring in the players that we need, and also does it allow us to keep the players that we want to keep? So will a Richarlison be more likely to leave the club or more likely to stay at the club with Benitez as manager rather than Carlo as manager, as we thought would be the case? I think that's a really difficult one, and probably the most relevant one. If James goes, I'm not sure that it's a massive loss. It's a lost opportunity, because to have a player like him on our books and not to get the best out of him is a lost opportunity. And obviously, if he goes, then we don't have that opportunity anymore. But on the evidence of last season, okay, when he was on the pitch, he performed well generally, but he wasn't on the pitch long enough. And there is a sort of a history, apparently, between him and Benitez. And there's also a feeling that James, when faced with a challenge, would rather move on elsewhere than try and solve the problem or solve the challenge that he faces. So whether he stays or not, I think is up for debate, and the probability is that he won't. Elsewhere across the squad, I don't think there's anybody else that might necessarily have a problem with Benitez. Alan was managed by Benitez at Napoli, and I don't think there were any problems there. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, what do you did you think? Obviously, the Liverpool thing was mentioned briefly, and I feel like that was sort of they had to briefly mention it because it's an elephant in the room. Do you think his answer about working for teams all over the world and fighting for them, do you think that is probably the best answer he could have gave at the time? Because I sort of don't know how else he would have gone about that.
Yeah, I think he answered. As I say, I think he answered that well. As I say, I don't really have an issue with the fact that he was a former Liverpool manager, but clearly he had to address that, and he's been a manager of other clubs since. The issue is whether or not ultimately the issue is whether or not his style of management is appropriate and consistent with what's required in the modern game. Because whilst, yes, he's got a tremendous CV and he's won trophies, he hasn't won an awful lot for the last 5 or 6 years. And, evidenced by his performance at Newcastle and his performance in China, there's a question mark, not over his commitment, not over his desire to succeed, because I suspect that's always going to be there. He's that type of person that will always work extremely hard. But just whether or not he's got what it takes to be a coach in modern football. Sadly, times move on and the game moves on. And as a result of that, sometimes it leaves people behind. And the question will be, until he proves otherwise, has the game left Benitez behind?
No problem. Well, speaking of, obviously his success across the world, I was wondering your thoughts on Farhad Moshiri's first statement, not the one he did with TalkSport, but the one he did on the day it was announced about Rafa, and saying he's, a top winner with huge experience. I was wondering if you could give me a bit of your thoughts on what Moshiri had said.
I thought he was being quite defensive, to be honest. I thought he felt that he had to justify his decision, and doing it in the format that he did it, in terms of written questions, written answers, wasn't very convincing. I think it would have been, and maybe just not possible, but in this day and age, you can get anybody on a video who wants to be on a video. I think those questions and the answers would have been far better in a sort of visual and audio presentation as against written answers. Clearly, Moshiri, well, he must believe what he wrote. Otherwise, he wouldn't have taken Benitez on board. But yeah, the slightly strange presentation, and then, of course, the following day, then to go on to talk sport, it's just very odd. And again, it comes back to, first of all, Moshiri having a slightly odd way of doing things, and secondly, the club not having sufficient control or sufficient ability to instruct Moshiri to do things in a way which is better for the club, as against a way that's convenient for Moshiri himself. I get that Moshiri possibly doesn't enjoy being in front of a camera, doesn't enjoy being in front of a microphone particularly. But that's, if you're going to be an owner of a Premier League football club, that's part of the package these days, and you have to be sufficiently media savvy to represent your club and to represent your views, particularly when when you've taken it upon yourself to take the decisions that he's taken. So I don't think he did himself any favors, not in terms of the answers, but in terms of the way the answers were presented.
No problem. Well, obviously, he later went on to TalkSport a couple of days. It was about a day later, I think it was, and he spoke a little bit. I'd say a little bit more honestly on TalkSport. I don't know if that's because, like you said, there weren't questions that were written out to him. I'm just wondering if you caught some of his comments and your thoughts on that. I thought he was a little bit more honest and open on TalkSport.
I didn't I didn't actually catch them because I don't listen to TalkSport. So because of their ownership, I absolutely refuse to listen to them. And I think I should say that I don't think the club and I don't think the owner should present their views through TalkSport neither. But hey, that's just my view.
No problem. Well, I've got a couple of them here. It was I'll summarise because he does go on for quite a while, and obviously him and Jim White are quite good friends because, like you said, we've communicated through TalkSport a couple of times since he's been there. But he said that he's the biggest fan, first of all, and he mentions this a lot, that he's the biggest fan. He said that when there was disconnect and rallies and banners against Martinez, he acted. When he wanted to get David Moyes in, there was real protests, so he didn't take David Moyes due to the protests. He then mentions how difficult, obviously, it is that Carlo Ancelotti's left him, and the disruption that's caused to the squad, which I think we all knew. Carlo leaving has really devastated him. But then he goes on to say about Benitez, he says he's one of the fans again. And then he says, our criteria is Premier League experience, winning trophies, dedicated, knowing the city, has an ability to perform, and even at Newcastle worked on no budget. I just want to know your thoughts on some of them. For me, reading between the lines, I almost thought with him starting off with I listened to the fans with Martinez, I listened with the protests when I wanted Moyes. This sort of came across as almost like he was going in for himself this time a little bit more, instead of taking on the fan opinion as much as as he claims he previously did.
Yeah, definitely. And as I said earlier, I think that's part of the sort of defensive nature of how he's presenting his argument for bringing Benitez in. Clearly when Martinez went in 2016, he acted very quickly against, or rather with the reaction of the fans following the FA Cup semi-final defeat in particular. But the idea that he acted in front of fans, I think is slightly strange, slightly weird. I don't think he's very well advised. I don't think he spends a lot of time thinking about how fans react to him. I don't think it's important to him, to be honest. But if you're going to make claims of being of acting in the interest of fans, then I think he needs to be slightly better advised than he is currently. I think the points about Benitez being a winner, well, yeah, he was a winner, but he's not a current winner. And I think you could argue 5 or 6 years after his last trophy, the point I made earlier, has he now got what it takes to be a winner in the modern game? I think the point about him being part of the city, engaged in the city, is a fair point to make. And, Benitez and his family have done a tremendous amount of good work for the people of Liverpool, for the people of Merseyside. But I question the relevance of that, really, to be honest. It's not, it's not a prerequisite of being a manager of Everton Football Club, or indeed any football club, that you've supported your community beforehand. And that's not a criticism of Benitez, of course. It's just a comment that for Moshiri to say it, slightly weird. But again, it comes back to the point I make about, is he well enough briefed, and is he well enough advised before he goes on to something like TalkSport and says what he says?
No problem. Well, we've obviously mentioned Moshiri's comments. I wanted to know what you thought about Bill Kenwright. I saw a couple of people saying it's not the normal Kenwright it's not the same almost energy that he had when we announced Ancelotti and the other managers we've announced. Do you think that is partly because of who we've appointed?
Yeah, Bill wears his heart on his sleeve, doesn't he? So if Bill's happy about something, it sings off the page. If Bill's not happy about something, the fact that the language was somewhat reserved, it's all there to see. Again, should Bill be more disciplined? Should the club be more disciplined and say, actually, we need something that's slightly stronger from you here, Bill? Yeah, absolutely, yes. Again, it comes back to communications and the briefing of communications.
No problem. Well, we have obviously mentioned Brands and Benitez's relationship with directors of football. Obviously, Benitez spoke about Brands, and Brands did likewise. I thought Brands' snippet was very short as well. Do you think they will get on together? Benitez obviously he said that they're both professionals, which from the off for me sort of gave the atmosphere that if you need to highlight that you're both professionals, it sort of highlights that, there might be an underlying issue there. I just wondered, do you think they'll get on together? Do you think there is something there, or do you think it's much of nothing?
it was fairly obvious that they'd not spoken much, and Brands had not really been part of the selection process, which in a sort of, I don't know, 4 or 5 interview process is a bit odd. I think time will tell. It goes back to the point we made earlier, doesn't it, about defining what Brands' role is. If Benitez thinks his role is to do first team recruitment, then somebody has to tell Brands. It comes down to clarity and people knowing what actually their roles are in the organization. I'm sure they'll get on sufficiently well to do whatever job they need to do. But the key point to this is not so much the personalities, it's defining the roles and who's got responsibility for, in the case of recruitment, in the case of moving players on, who's going to do that? Clearly, one would think that would be Brands' role, but it's something that they need to sort out, and they probably need to come together again, sort of visually and talk to fans about what it is that they're going to do. Now, whether the club will adopt that, I don't know, but it would make sense to provide some clarity so that the question goes away. Whether actually in reality it works out that way, only time will tell. But it would be a really good idea if the club put both of them in front of a microphone and they both talked about their respective roles and how they can work together.
Problem. Obviously, we've mentioned the influence or lack of the appointment from Brands. There was a lot of influence though coming from Usmanov during this. Obviously, he was tied with saying that he wanted Benitez and actually went out of his way to speak to Roman Abramovich and get his thoughts on it all. I just thought your thoughts on this, because it's pretty much Usmanov coming more into the public eye and sort of hinting at just how much of an influence he has at the back at Everton.
Well, it's reporters reporting that these things happened. It's not actually Usmanov or Moshiri saying that this was the case. I think it's quite a disturbing development if it is the case, to be honest. I don't think that the club should have people who are totally unaccountable, totally unconnected to the club, being put in such positions. And again, it comes back to a favourite bugbear of mine, which is governance. The club has to operate like a proper business and not just be something that's at the whim of the owner. In this case, Moshiri. I have no problem with the fact that they're business partners and they both love football and they both must talk about football an awful lot. That's fine, but I don't think it does anybody any favors to present a case that says Usmanov has made management selections or he's sought advice from a fellow oligarch. That's if you're doing that, you have to be inside the tent, not outside the tent. Now, I don't think Usmanov should be inside the tent. And I've said that on many, many occasions. But he certainly shouldn't be in a position of advising and influencing from the outside. So I think it's a disturbing development. He's involved in the club to the extent that USM are a major sponsor of the club. To me, that's as far as it should go. And if he wants to be involved in other aspects of how the club is run, then he needs to have a formal position within the club. And people need to know exactly what that position is, what his responsibilities are, and how he is accountable to fans. Because if he's involved in a decision and that decision doesn't work out right, what redress do we have as fans? What redress do we have as minority shareholders in Everton Football Club to somebody that's not formally associated with the club? So I think it's a disturbing development from my perspective, and it's a development that again Farhad Moshiri needs to address, and if he doesn't address it, then the remaining minority shareholders need to address it.
No problem. I just wanted your thought as well on obviously when Benitez was doing Finch Farm, they did a lot of photo ops. Obviously, one with Duncan Ferguson, he did a couple with Leighton Baines and a couple of others sort of stood on the line. Sabar Ismailov was there as well, who's more involved with the women's team, but is also the nephew of Usmanov. Do you think it was just a matter of he was at Finch Farm at the time, or do you think he had, or do you think it's a bit odd that he was there with the influence with Benitez? Do you think he was another voice being heard?
I don't think he was necessarily part of the decision-making process for Benitez, but there's clearly a reason as to why he was involved in showing him around, and why he was film showing him around, and why he was standing next to him in several photographs. My understanding is that there's going to be some significant changes at boardroom level, and that might involve Ismailov becoming a board member. Again, is this sort of the club softening us up for something that's going to happen in the not too distant future? I don't know, but it certainly wasn't an accident. It was done with the purpose in mind.
No problem. To change a bit of pace from Benitez, we'll go on to something that's a little bit more positive. I want your thoughts on the Everton announcement of the construction of a new stadium starting on the 26th of July this year. I know obviously you tweeted out about it as well, about the funding and Moshiri. So I just thought if I could get your opinions on that.
Okay, I mean, clearly it's very good news that the building works are about to start, because if we are to get into the stadium for the first game of the 24-25 season, we had to start the building, the proper building works in the middle of this summer, because it is a 3-year process. And if you look at the schedule over the 3 years, it's a very tight schedule. There's very limited opportunity for, if there are problems or things go wrong, things take longer than you would expect. So there's very little contingency built into the 3-year build program. So it was very, very important that work started. The interesting bit for me is that the way in which it's going to be funded, it was always described as being funded through some form of borrowing, be it the city council, which obviously isn't going to be the case, or be it private lenders, which would probably still be the case. And that Moshiri and that the naming rights partner would then fund the difference between however much we borrowed and however much we've spent, but it would be done in the order of borrowings, Moshiri, naming rights partner. The fact that we're now doing it in a slightly different order and that Moshiri is kicking off the funding suggests to me that the lending part of the funding is not in place, but we couldn't wait for that to be in place because of the time constraints that I've just mentioned. So therefore, Moshiri has had to pay for this next stage of the development out of his own pocket, as against maybe paying for it in 2 years or 3 years' time. So that'll be a cash flow issue for Moshiri, but I'm sure he has the cash resources to see that through. Otherwise, he wouldn't put himself in that position. But it's just interesting that it's going down that route rather than the one that's been talked about since about 2017, when we first talked about Bramley-Moore and how Bramley-Moore is going to be funded.
No problem. Do you think that sort of, obviously you said about cash restraint, do you reckon that might be, just thinking back then to the comments I've just read from him where he said that he worked at Newcastle on a budget, do you think that might be somewhat of a reason behind it, just because obviously Benitez works on a budget, and also I've seen a lot of people reckon that he's a safe pair of hands that would, I don't think this should be the way of thinking, but would keep us in the Premier League. Although I must say I don't think we were ever in. I think we've got far too good of a quality to ever be sort of that in that type of trouble. But do you reckon that is sort of what played into his mind as well?
I think undoubtedly that has to be the case, because if you look at Arsenal, when Arsenal Stadium was built, the lenders put quite strict conditions upon Arsenal in terms of how much they could spend, how much money they had to hold in reserve, even to the extent that they had to offer Arsene Wenger a much longer term contract than the Arsenal board wanted to offer him. So there's no doubt at all that when you when you're going through a building process and when you're borrowing significant sums of money, the lenders will have influence over what happens within the organization. So does that mean that the days of enormous spending in the transfer market are over? Yes, it probably does. Partly because of what the lenders require, but also unless we get to the point where we're both in the stadium and we're regularly qualifying for European football, we're going to continue making big losses. We're going to make a bigger loss in the last financial year, which just finished at the end of last month, than we did in the previous year. And we won't make quite as big a loss this year. Excuse me. We won't make quite a bigger loss this year because some of our costs are reduced and our income will go up because the stadium will be open again. But we're going to make a loss this year. And if we don't get European football in the following year, we're likely to make a loss as well. So all of these things have to have an impact on our ability to spend. And it might be that, we've been very keen. We would have liked to have sold Keane, I think, and we would have preferred, I think, to have sold Keane before the end of the financial year, at the end of June. But clearly, we haven't done that. There needs to be the sale of at least, I think, one player in order to generate some player trading profits, which will offset the costs of bringing other players in. Because clearly, we're going to bring players in. But we bring players in, and if we don't sell anybody, then we're just increasing our costs. Now, I know that several players have left that were on big contracts, but those contracts will be just exchanged for the players that are coming in. So that won't necessarily mean that we're going to spend less money. So yeah, I think we're in quite a tight position. Now, the one positive is that the market for players outside the very, very top players, which we're probably not going for anyway, is going to be very constrained because all of the other clubs who are in looking for similar types of players all have their own financial difficulties as well. So in that sense, it helps us slightly that other clubs have COVID-related financial difficulties. But it's not going to be easy, and I don't think we should expect Moshiri to continue to fund losses, to continue to fund the stadium, which he's now going to do, as we talked about, and also fund player acquisitions. I mean, that just doesn't happen.
Not a problem. Before we end, it's just a curious one. What do you think? I just want your opinion. What do you think would be the best way moving forward? And then just to end it off, ideal world, who would you have liked us to get as manager? Just because I'm always curious to know what other Everton fans wanted.
The best way of moving forward, I think, is to sort out the academy so that we have a clear pathway for talent that's coming through the academy to the first team. I think we need to, if possible, move on those people that are still in the first team squad but don't contribute, but cost us a lot of money. And I think we need an identifiable style of football going forwards. So I think Benitez has to sort of probably tell us what that's going to be before the season starts. And we need to state what our ambitions are and do whatever we need to do to achieve those ambitions. And those ambitions must be to qualify for European football at the end of next season. Can we qualify for Champions League under Benitez? Well, it's possible, but it's unlikely. I think qualifying for the Europa League is probably about as far as as we could hope for. Who did I think should have been our manager? Well, I always think that Everton Football Club should have the best. So it would never happen, but I would like Pep Guardiola to be our manager. But I know, obviously, clearly, it's not going to happen. In terms of realistically, it would have been great if we could have persuaded, and this will sound slightly odd, a manager like Brendan Rodgers away from Leicester. But he's clearly onto a good thing. He's got good owners, and they're clearly progressing as a club. But yeah, that style of manager. I suppose the other manager I would have gone for, but this would have been with a view to a more long-term project, would have been Potter, because I think he plays good football. Again, he comes from a club with a very solid background, good owners, and they know the direction in which they're going. I think he could have done a really good job for us over sort of 2 or 3 years, but it would have probably meant that we would have stood still or gone backwards slightly initially before progressing. So yeah, that's my view on managers.
No, I must admit, I was sort of I was in the Potter camp as well. I was sort of hoping we could pull that off. I'm a big fan of the XG philosophy he's got going on down there.
Yeah.
But thank you, Paul. That's been everything here on the Toffee Blues for us. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, comment down below. You can follow me on Twitter. My link will be in the description, and you can follow Paul the Esk on Twitter. And Paul, I just want to say thank you once again for coming on the channel. As always, it's been enlightening.
Great pleasure. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
It's been a pleasure, mate. Thank you.